housing crisis sweeping across much of the Western world has become a generational challenge, an economic paradox that resists easy solutions. While each nation contends with its own unique circumstances, a common theme emerges: the struggle to construct enough homes to meet demand, thereby keeping prices from soaring out of reach for young families and the working class. In few places have the tremors of this quandary been felt more acutely than in Sweden, that bastion of Nordic social democracy long renowned for its egalitarian ethics and communal solidarity. This small nation of 10 million souls has in many ways been a bellwether for the wrenching shifts reshaping contemporary economics and the fissures emerging in the modern social compact. The Swedish housing predicament encapsulates the push and pull between market forces and governmental intervention. It highlights the tensions between nurturing a robust private sector and maintaining a strong social safety net. It underscores the vulnerabilities spawned by globalization, the whiplash of capital flows, supply chain disruptions, and ripple effects from economic upheaval in far-flung corners of an interdependent world. Above all, Sweden's housing woes reflect the philosophical quandaries embedded in the very notion of achieving the good home, the elemental human desire for shelter morphing into a commoditized asset class subject to the invisible hand of market fluctuations. The idea of a home as a societal rudder, a bedrock foundation for family life and personal fulfillment, seems increasingly imperiled by market caprice and ever-accelerating cycles of boom and bust. For a nation long esteemed as a progressive vanguard, these travails have precipitated a bout of anguished introspection. How could a country so affluent, so committed to social welfare, find itself grappling with a housing shortage so severe? How is it possible that legions of young Swedes now scrimp and save for years to purchase a modest dwelling, while others resign themselves to renting in perpetuity? Has the celebrated middle way finally reached its limits, leaving a daylight of unmet housing needs no amount of state intervention can bridge? These are the overarching questions framing the housing conundrum in Sweden today, a riddle encapsulated by the latest data showing a wobbly rebound in residential construction activity. On the surface, the big facta figures for June appear to signal at least a tentative comeback in home building after a brutal 18-month slump. Beneath that faint glimmer of promise, however, lies an array of hazards portending an agonizingly slow, halting recovery at best. The 2% month-over-month decline in housing starts was enough to douse any excessive optimism fueled by earlier modestly positive readings. Revisions downgrading prior figures only added to the pall of uncertainty. The sobering metrics form the latest blip in an ongoing saga of volatility and diminished expectations for an industry battered by surging costs, higher borrowing rates, and collapsing demand. The situation has improved this year, but the recovery seems to be on shaky ground, said Tor Borg, Big Facta's head of analysis, in a classic bit of Nordic understatement. His hope that some combination of lower interest rates and broader economic revival can catalyze a stronger homebuilding rebound is as much a plea as a prognostication, a wistful prayer that Sweden may yet engineer its way out of this crisis. For many Swedes, however, such official assurances ring increasingly hollow, the obligatory murmurs of mild optimism belied by a relentless undertow of economic headwinds. After years of escalating property prices amidst chronic undersupply, a harsh reckoning is underway. The once reliable escalator of home equity appreciation has stalled, plunging legions of households under a cloud of negative equity as asset values tumble. Layered on top are the reverberations of pandemic-induced supply shocks, the fallout from Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and a severe spike in global inflation that pushed the Swedish Riksbank to jack up its benchmark lending rate to a dizzying 15-year high of 4% in 2022. Once a strength, Sweden's intricate enmeshment with the international flows of capital, labor, and commodities morphed into a source of newfound vulnerability. The same liberalized financial environment that facilitated free movement of investment also allowed a swift exodus of spooked speculative capital at the first whiff of economic instability. Meanwhile, the outsized reliance on Russian energy imports left Sweden, like much of Europe, exposed to the vicissitudes of geopolitics far from its borders. Talk to Swedes from across the societal spectrum and a common refrain emerges: resignation that the heady days of seemingly effortless upward mobility may be fading into the rearview mirror. Some rue that their children will likely never enjoy the same rungs of middle-class prosperity and home ownership taken for granted by prior generations. Others fret about the impacts of spiraling costs and dwindling inventory on Sweden's egalitarian ethos. It feels like the rules have changed, says Malin Pettersson, a university administrator raising 3 school-age children with her husband Anders in the city of Malmö. Even with decent jobs, buying a place never felt harder. My parents were both teachers but could easily afford a nice house in the suburbs. We may need to resign ourselves to perpetual renting and tiny spaces. The Petterssons' purgatory is hardly unique in today's Sweden. From Stockholm to Gothenburg, young couples forego homeownership dreams to subsist in cramped rental units or clusters of families pool resources to collectively purchase a detached dwelling. Runaway home prices and stagnant incomes have relegated ownership to rarefied terrain. Even the modest 3-bedroom row house the Petterssons covet can cost the equivalent of $500,000 or more in Sweden's major metro areas these days. It's a scenario simultaneously fueling a rising tide of disillusionment and testing the durability of Sweden's vaunted social compact. The traditional Scandinavian recipe of high taxes enabling a generous public safety net appears increasingly strained as expenditures swell and proceeds from economic growth fail to keep up. A Swedish proverb admonishes that shared misery is half the misery. Yet as home-owning dreams prove elusive for more and more citizens, that ancient wisdom feels like cold comfort in cities where multi-generational apartment living is fast becoming an unwelcome new norm. Beyond the philosophical questions, there are practical impacts to contend with too. Restrictive housing supply and high costs constrain mobility, making it harder for workers to chase job opportunities. Family formation trends are also being disrupted as young adults are forced to shack up with roommates longer or remain in their parents' homes, instead of setting off to form independent households. Some demographers warn Sweden risks following Japan and parts of Western Europe into a spiral of declining fertility and population stagnation should the housing situation remain unresolved over the long run. The housing shortage touches every aspect of our society, says Fredrik Andersson, an economist at the University of Gothenburg. It drags on economic growth, constricts labor markets, and deters new business formation. Untangling this Gordian knot requires fresh thinking and bold solutions. Indeed, the deepening predicament has catalyzed impassioned debate across Sweden about how to tackle the crisis, shaking up long-standing political coalitions in the process. Once reliable conservative blocs are splintering, with pro-development factions framing state intervention as a necessary evil to revive private housing construction through tax incentives, looser zoning rules, and regulatory rollbacks. Traditional center-left forces, long aligned with tenant groups, are increasingly being tugged toward more market-oriented positions as popular angst over tight inventories rises. When I hear some of my social democratic colleagues dismissing market-based solutions as heretical, I have to remind them, this is affecting party members too, says Björn Samuelsson, a lawmaker with the ruling center-left coalition in parliament. Teachers, nurses, factory workers, all are struggling to access decent housing. We need to show some flexibility if we hope to ease the shortage. On the flip side, libertarian-leaning camps advocate abolishing strict rental controls and rolling back green mandates they say strangle construction activity and deter needed investment from institutional players like pension funds. The Swedish market remains woefully distorted by heavy-handed regulation, argues Christian Holm, director of the Confederation of Swedish Enterprise, a business lobby group, rectifying flawed housing policies. And yes, that includes more liberal reforms, has to be our top priority if we want to pull out of this crisis. Such rhetoric would have been considered political anathema in Sweden not long ago. Yet as discontents fester, a willingness to entertain unconventional remedies appears to be taking hold. Enter figures like Ake Sundsvall, a brash real estate developer and self-styled iconoclast who has become something of a folk hero for his blunt exhortations to expand home building at all costs. Zoning laws and environmental constraints be damned. We've let a bunch of ideologues with no understanding of markets clog up the housing pipeline, Sundsvall told a raucous rally in Stockholm last month. If we don't want to see more Swedes fleeing the country for affordable homes elsewhere, it's time to unleash the private sector. While such outbursts draw eye rolls from the establishment, Sundsvall's pugilistic message is clearly resonating with anxious homebuyers and profit-hungry builders. Rising anti-EU sentiment and a spate of wildcat housing protests across Sweden suggest a sea change could be afoot in a country long allergic to populist rabble-rousing. Not everyone finds the prospect of radical housing reforms palatable, however. Long accustomed to a high degree of economic equality, many Swedes fear deregulation could concentrate home ownership in fewer hands while displacing disadvantaged communities. Environmental advocates decry any rollback of safeguards they deem vital to sustainability. There are certainly smart ways to streamline rules to boost construction without torching our entire system, remarked Sven Lindholm, an urban planner in Stockholm. We should be smarter about upzoning areas well served by transit, legalizing more accessory units, and incentivizing multifamily infill. But a wild west of unfettered developer appetite is not the answer. Indeed, Lindholm and other pro-density urbanists argue the housing crisis itself is but a symptom of Sweden's failure to adequately push consolidation and redevelopment in its major job centers like Stockholm. They see too much restrictive zoning still shunting builders toward far-flung exurban fringes disconnected from efficient transit corridors. This only exacerbates unsustainable sprawl, carbon emissions, and service delivery costs. For every reformer keen to exempt housing from stringent environmental review processes, there are earnest environmentalists demanding tougher codes and impact fees to mitigate suburban proliferation. As the debate rages on about what degree of deregulation may be warranted, both camps claim the ethical high ground of sustainable housing policies. This dizzying array of cross-cutting tensions, generational divides, regional cleavages, competing progressive agendas, is what makes the Swedish predicament so thorny. The path forward remains frustratingly unclear. Measures that could meaningfully boost homebuilding in the near term inevitably seem to cut against other deeply held national priorities like climate action, equitable growth, or social stability. Many housing experts caution there are no quick policy tweaks to conjure a magic turnaround either. The cyclical nature of real estate, while pronounced in Sweden, is hardly unique. Global investment trends, skilled labor scarcities, and other bottlenecks factor heavily into the equation. So too do secular shifts like evolving household formation patterns, new workplace models enabling geographic flexibility, and climate adaptation imperatives that require holistic residential strategies beyond just ramping up production volumes. I wish I could tell everyone that, if we implement these few simple steps, we'll exit the housing crunch and restore robust home price growth, sighs Nina Carlson, a property developer and housing data analyst. The truth is far more complicated than that. What most concur is that some fresh blend of public purpose and private incentive holds the key to alleviating Sweden's woes over time. Packing more rental units and condos into already vibrant job centers through strategic upzoning, while rethinking sprawl-inducing homebuilding in remote exurbs that saddle municipalities with unsustainable service costs. Lightening the thicket of regulatory hurdles and development fees to draw more players into the market, while maintaining smart urban growth boundaries and ecological safeguards. Simultaneously, thoughtful interventions could help stimulate healthier demand than what's driven recent boom/bust cycles rooted in speculation rather than organic household formation. Well-structured rent assistance, equity co-investment models, and liberalized immigrant investor pathways could all expand access. Tax credits incentivizing employers to provide portable housing benefits could increase worker mobility. We need to look at housing policies holistically instead of as isolated tweaks, says Carlson. How can we make ownership equitable and sustainable over the long haul? How do we align better with transportation networks households can actually utilize without relying on carbon-spewing commutes? Housing touches everything: jobs, education, climate, family policy. Only comprehensive strategies get at the deeper roots. Ultimately, the Swedish housing morass underscores a core quandary of modern liberal democracy, navigating the balance between public sector guardrails and private sector dynamism. For every earnest progressive seeking to legislate affordability and equitable access, there's an equally sincere libertarian railing against government distortions and the deadweight costs of intervention. Adjudicating that tension forms the Gordian knot at the heart of the housing dilemma, both for Sweden and the West more broadly. Perhaps nowhere in Sweden do the myriad threads of this tangled housing predicament intersect more vividly than in the nation's storied capital city of Stockholm. A global hub for tech innovation and entrepreneurship, the city has welcomed an influx of educated workers and disruptive startups in recent years. Yet its aging housing stock and constricted residential development pipeline have failed to keep pace with surging demand. The resulting affordability crunch risks jeopardizing Stockholm's economic ascent.